Yes, so, let me, bear with me 1 second here. There we go. This May, I had big plans to fly to Portland and talk with a bunch of technical writers, and then take the train up to Seattle and visit some friends I hadn't seen in a decade and play tourist over all the Pacific Northwest. And none of that happened. So instead, what happened was a virtual conference in late August, which was good. Same group of technical writers, but without the travel or visiting friends. So I'm just going to tell you some thoughts and notes about what I took from that, and some ideas it generated, and how we might apply those ideas going forward. Oops. All right, so first, one of the things I wanted to really dive into that I was unsure of when attending this conference was how the conference was going to work at all. I'd never done a virtual conference like this before. You know, I didn't know if it was going to be just mind-numbingly difficult or frustrating, or even just the logistics of how it was going to work out. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Then go over a couple of ideas that I got from the talk, some of the good keynotes that I saw, some future directions for NREO and GPO that prompted, and then at the end talk briefly about cannibalism. That's what's called a tease. So the conference itself was hosted on a platform called Hopin, and it actually worked really well for several reasons. The biggest thing, I think, for the platform was it was all web-based. There wasn't any additional software to download. There were no configuration issues that I ran into. Everything there was done with in the browser. I was using Firefox. I think some other folks are using Chrome and Edge. I didn't hear any technical issues in terms of any of the participants that I was talking with. Worked very well. I think it was using WebRTC for everything. And overall, I was very impressed. In the confines of having to sit at this desk and pay attention and do a conference style workflow for 2.5 days, exclusively in the browser, I had very little to complain about, and honestly think that this platform may be useful for us going forward as we continue pandemic mitigation and think about hosting our own larger events like this. That said, I did not look at all in terms of what the costs were, or any pricing and licensing, anything like that. But just in terms of user experience, I thought it worked really well. Like I said, usability, it was really easy to use. The keynote talks were all pre-recorded and broadcast via YouTube, so there was flexibility there in terms of when and where and how things were done. And another thing that I thought was particularly useful were the virtual rooms. You could go in and click on a room and instantly be connected into a smaller chat, video chat with people that were there. And it actually worked really well to recreate that experience of getting your little corner of the hallway or grabbing one of the smaller conference rooms and talking about a given topic, or carrying on an informal conversation in more in depth and inviting people over. I was actually really impressed with how well that worked. There was also a networking feature where you could say, "Hey, I'm in between talks," or "I'm just my brain is full. I just want to chat with random people I haven't met before," and you could put yourself in the queue and be connected randomly with someone else that was in the queue, and it would give you 5 minutes or 3 minutes, I think, to just chat, and then you could extend it or move it on into another smaller room if you were having a good conversation and wanted to keep going. It felt a little like speed dating, but for professional people. But it actually worked really well. I got to chat with some other folks doing similar work, and really got some LinkedIn connections, and really enjoyed the whole experience. So let's talk a little bit about who was at the conference. They were all people that were interested in technical documentation enough to spend money and time to go to a convention called Write the Docs. That said, there were relatively few people that I spoke to that were trained from the beginning, and in terms of technical writing or English degrees or journalism degrees. Most people that were at the conversation were like me. They were software developers, they were project managers, they were engineers of one flavor or another, and they had come to technical writing out of necessity as much as out of a desire to, hey, I really enjoy writing. I want to write for a living. So it's a much different mix of people than you might otherwise expect or experience. There were a couple of people that actually did have actual English degrees, but they were in the minority of people that I spoke to. Also, just in terms of the conference itself, it was a much more diverse group than I anticipated. I really wasn't sure what it was going to be like going into it, but there was a wide variety of folks in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of background. Lots of good people, lots of good things to talk about. And also, this is a conference that the Write the Docs group does every year. Actually, they do one in Portland now. They were going to do one on the East Coast, but that got canceled like everything else in life did around March. And they do one in Europe, I forget the city, but they do this conference every year. There's also a very active Slack channel where people can discuss ideas and talk about things. And several people also pointed me to other resources, blogs, a couple of good books that are on my to-read list now. So overall, a very good feel of community and finding my tribe, as it were. It was a good bunch of people. And I didn't have the normal conference experience of explaining what radio astronomy was, or how our software stack was different and unusual compared to everyone else at PyCon or somewhere that is focused on developing web apps or doing trying to label themselves as a data scientist. So with that, my group will make fun of me for using the word documentarian. I can hear some of you snickering now, even though you're muted. I know who you are, Paul. But that's the term that Write the Docs uses for anyone who does this kind of work. It does not refer to people like Ken Burns. If I was trying to get support from my spouse. I said, Hannah, my group always makes fun of me when I use the word documentarian, and she laughed just like everybody else. I said, no, it doesn't mean Ken Burns. What does it mean? It means everyone who's writing documents or has an interest or need for documentation. This was a screen grab from the opening keynote. So those are writers, certainly people that are billed as writers or paid as writers, but also developers, testers, marketing professionals, community support advocates, DevOps, graphics designers. Those are all the things that were listed in the conference, and that I would add, our group, scientists, machinists, engineers, technicians, really anybody that works with other people, because documentation isn't an end to itself. It's a means to an end. It's a means of sharing information, sharing knowledge to go and do other things. And that was one of the big takeaways. Actually, there was a whole keynote that espoused that in quite a bit of detail that I quite liked. One thing that I read years and years ago, and I could not find the original reference. I'm wanting to say it was a Carl Sagan quote, but I couldn't find it in a brief search. But you could make an argument that what separates humans from other species on the planet is external data storage. We are unique or very, very unusual in, sorry, Siri's being contrary. One second. Yeah, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Oh, bear with me, my apologies. Technical difficulties. Okay, sorry about that. Something I said in that impassioned rant kicked on Siri, and Siri started playing a very good REM album. Where was I? External data storage. So we write down things, we can pass on information to other people. This is a picture of part of my personal library. That's more of it. That's the shelf directly above me. If you could see me gesturing. I joked to the boys one time when they were grousing about going to school that if they read everything in the house, I wouldn't make them go to school anymore. And they thought initially that might be a good idea, and then they realized that we had tons of those days. Tons of different textbooks as well. All of Hannah's textbooks from graduate school, plus the entire CRC handbook is in here somewhere. So they decided that wasn't a good way to go. So in that spirit, in the idea of expressing ideas and changing knowledge and giving knowledge to other people, the talks generally fell into one of three categories. One, the craft of writing itself, the nuts and bolts, the discussions about grammar, the considerations of accessibility or translation, things like that. That was one part of it. A second one, and this is more specific to technical writing as opposed to journalism or creative writing or things in general, were the tools and pipelines used. Technical writing increasingly is wanting to view documentation as code and treat it as such. So there were a couple of talks about using Jupyter to document and run tests. There was a good talk about creating quality code samples and showing your code documentation in samples that would be consumed and read by other folks. There was a couple of talks about structured data, which didn't quite apply as much in our situation as some other folks, but were interesting nonetheless. And then the third thing was managing this. Again, if you're Neil Stephenson and you're writing a novel, you go into your study in the morning and you write for 4 hours, and then you do that for enough days and months, and eventually you get a manuscript you can give to your editor, and it's a fairly straightforward process. For documentation, for technical fields, for a new receiver or a new instrument or a new pipeline, a new process that we're doing for radio astronomy, the management component takes a much bigger part of it, and that has its own considerations. So there were some talks about that were interesting as well. So in that light, first, the talks about writing were important, but I'm not going to spend much time on them because they're not our primary focus. I don't think that's the biggest thing we have to think about right now as an organization. That said, I think that accessibility is something we should always kind of keep in the background in our mind when crafting any documentation, when building web pages, when doing anything that we want to share with other people, because we don't necessarily know what those other people have in terms of constraints. They may be blind users. There may be users that have motor issues. Actually, one of the talks at Write the Docs was given by someone who was deaf and had an interesting perspective on collaboration in terms of those constraints. So it's something to keep in mind. I encourage everyone to keep that in mind as they create documentation, whatever it may be. Similarly, internationalization is one. And that one touches a little closer to home for us because radio astronomy is an international field, always has been. And that is something that we should take into account as well. But again, there hasn't been a real push to do this sort of translation or internationalization in the way that folks say publishing a web application might want. If they're deliberately trying to grow an audience in Asia or other parts of the world, they may make that more of a focus. Whereas for us, for better or worse, most of the journals that we're publishing information in are English-based. So internationalization is a concern for us. I think it's something, again, to keep in the background and consider, but may not be worth us as an organization putting tons of resources in to translate all of our documents or paperwork to various languages, unless that becomes a greater need. However, tools and pipelines, there were a couple of talks about that I thought were much more interesting in terms of my personal and professional interests, and much more applicable to GBO and radio astronomy as a whole. One of the best talks was about using Jupyter to both serve as a document to give as an example of how to run a process or a pipeline or a certain tool, and use that same document to run tests, both to test the system itself and to test your own examples, to make sure that the example that you publish, that you give to someone in a document, that, hey, this is how you use this pipeline, this is how you use this process, making sure that your code examples still work in a year or 2 years or 5 years after they've been published, and you may not have revisited them in that time. Jupyter is something that we've discussed informally to varying degrees in the last couple of years in my group, in the software group. And I continue to think more and more that it would be a very good platform to do this sort of thing. And in the talk about using Jupyter as both example documentation and testing in line, I thought immediately of not the MNC system, for example, or some of those things, but some of the pipelining and data processing things, the things that the science staff normally handles, and that they are giving to collaborators, to our users, to observers that may need to learn how to use a given tool chain, or do a certain process to decimate their data, or do noise reduction, whatever they need to do. Jupyter would be a good place to both have that documentation that we could give to observers, as well as using ways to ensure that those examples were current and still worked over time. There was one talk by a group at Lawrence Berkeley, which actually had a process very similar to ours. They were doing some big chemistry simulations, if memory serves, but they were doing similar sorts of stuff where they had this specialized pipeline to crank through data, and they needed to both show other users how to do that and make sure that those examples worked over time. And they used a similar process to what we're actually doing internally in the software group. They were even using a lot of the same tools. They were using Sphinx to host the static content, and had a pipeline where anytime they changed an example, Sphinx would automatically rebuild it and publish it if it needed to be published and everything did work. They had a container set up. They actually were using Docker to do that, which we have explored and discounted for various reasons I won't get into. But very similar process to treat the documentation, the examples they wanted to share, as code, where you would check it in, run it through a process. If it all checked out and it worked, then it would be published for general use. And again, we're doing a lot of this already with the SDD docs. Sorry, whoever named that was terrible. That was me. But the SDD docs repo, anytime you check in something there, it fires off a build automatically. If that build succeeds, it automatically publishes it. That project also grabs documentation from various other projects. It grabs the docs directory from the various MNC repositories and publishes those as well. Adding automatic PDF generation is something that I want to do, something we haven't just made time for, frankly. And there's some organization and just general writing, actually making the words flow a little better, making the site a little more organized. But I was pleased to see that a lot of the things that we'd been kind of thinking about and discussing and playing with informally were actually the right thing to do. The same ideas, same solutions that other groups solving similar problems were coming to. So if you haven't seen it already, docs.greenbakeobservatory.org is where that's currently living, and it will get better over time, hopefully in the next few weeks and months. Another thing that I want to add to that whole process is a tool called Veil. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic and trying to manage small children and now doing school virtually in a small house where all four of us are now trying to work, I haven't had the mental bandwidth to do much more than install Veil locally and just verify that it's installed. But it's something that I'm super excited about. What Veil is a linter for prose. Thomas Chamberlain, one of our software engineers, has done a lot of excellent work making sure that we have linters for our source code. So when we check it in Python, it does a bunch of stuff automatically to fix the formatting, to alert us to Python 2 to 3 issues, to only import the things that we need to import and not import star. It'll call us out on all of those things, all of which makes our source code better. Veil aims to do the same thing with prose. You can give it a style guide. You can give it terms of art that are specific to your organization or to your field, and it will flag things for you. Making sure your abbreviations are consistent, making sure you're following those style guides, making sure you spell astrid properly. Capital A, R-S-T-A-S-T-R, capital I, capital D, because it does stand for Astronomers Integrated Desktop. So these are things that I could tell Veil to just automatically fix for you, or to be a little more passive aggressive and flag it as warnings and kind of let you know that, hey, you should spell astrid consistently. So that's a tool that I'm super excited about, and hopefully we'll see that going forward in the next few weeks or months. Another talk they did, and this is kind of where I'll wrap up with, is the concept of documentation debt and how to manage large documentation projects and how to get a handle on what we mean by documentation generally for technical writers and for documentation for technical fields in general. And documentation debt was a term that one presenter used to make an analogy to technical debt that we talk about fairly frequently. Things that we like to do or we should do, we haven't gotten around to, or short-term fixes that we're going to do now because we don't want to spend a lot of time on this, and we swear to ourselves we're going to go back and make that better later, and then it never seems to happen, and we move on to the next project, or that person gets a different job, or we change over, or the pandemic happens and all of our plans go out the window. So we're familiar with the concept of technical debt. Documentation debt is a directly analogous to that. And frankly, it has a similar structure in how to tackle it. You first have to analyze. You have to look and see where you need documentation. What do your users need? What does your audience need? Then you have to design and structure a working plan to how you're going to address those needs for your user community. Actually write the content, and then basically start a loop where you are iteratively developing that content, just like you would a research project, just like you would be developing a new instrument or a new software project. The same basic workflow applies, but I think it's important to note that explicitly and not just assume that documentation is something you do in the last 2 weeks of a project that just happens magically and you can do it once and then it's done. You can never look at it again. So, if you take nothing else from this talk, look at your documentation as a project, as a product to be delivered and iterated on consistently, not just as something that you check off in the last 2 weeks of a project and then call it done. This one is more text than it probably needs to be. But I took a lot of notes on that talk about how to deal with documentation debt, validating assumptions, creating a strategy, getting feedback from all the stakeholders. A lot of this sounds exactly like how we would structure a software project or building a new instrument, because it is. Ultimately, it's the exact same workflow, only instead of delivering a software product or a piece of hardware or a scientific result, we are delivering a document which will help people do whatever they need to do. And that's the other thing I think that is an important takeaway, is to remember at all times that documentation isn't being written because you've got to check that box off on your project management plan. It's not being checked off because your division head or somebody said, hey, we need to just do this. Realize that is there for someone else to accomplish something. And that someone else may well be you. And ultimately, that was the whole reason that I got interested in technical writing initially, was because I wanted those documents. How many times have people downloaded a software project or tried a new tool or a new thing, and you can tell right away the professionalism of a project or not based on the documentation. If the documentation is clear and easy to use and helps you get some results right away, you're going to stick with that tool, you're going to stick with that project. If it's hard, if it takes time to jump through hoops, if it's not clear what you're supposed to be doing, if things are inconsistent, you're much more likely to abandon that effort, whatever it might be. So keep that in mind as well as we go forward. And finally, I did promise you cannibalism, and here it is. This is a famous photo of a dog magazine featuring Rachel Ray, where it illustrates the importance of the Oxford comma, or the serial comma as it's called, and why you should always use it. Because if you read this, I actually had Tristan read it before my talk. Rachel Ray finds inspiration in cooking her family and her dog. And I said, hey, man, what's wrong with that? And my 10-year-old looked at me and said, she's going to serve her family and her dog for dinner. So he got it right away. However, in researching this very famous example of why you should use the Oxford comma, and if you don't agree with that statement, you're wrong. But in researching this famous example, I actually found out it was a hoax. The Tales group or publisher actually had to publish an article saying that that was photoshopped, and the version on the right here was a screen grab of what actually hit the newsstand, where they did do it properly. Nonetheless, it's a great example of why punctuation matters, why attention to detail matters in grammar, and how your meanings can change drastically based on how you phrase things and how you write things. So again, just to pound home that point even more, you're not writing to check a box. You are writing to convey information to help other people do great things. So bear that in mind every time you are creating documentation and sharing it with anybody, even as small as just your group, all the way to publishing results in a journal, or writing something that's going to be seen by the entire radio astronomy community. Take the time to make sure you are clear as possible, and that you are communicating exactly what you want to communicate. You don't have to write all of this down. I will provide my slides to Natalie with all these resources. All the talks are recorded on YouTube. I provided various links to a couple of good books, a couple of the tools that I talked about. So I'll share all those for anyone that's interested. Also, if you do have any other questions or comments about anything, feel free to email me or hit me up on the NRAO Slack channel, and I'd be happy to discuss technical writing and documentation ad nauseum. So with that, thanks for listening. Thank you for dealing with my weird technical issue in the middle, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Actually, there's one question I can already see in the chat. Can you say something about knowing your audience? Who the documentation is for? Yeah, that is standard writing advice. That's something that you hear in your freshman writing class. Know your audience. Write to your audience. If you can, talk to your audience directly. It may be collaborators, it may be coworkers, it may be people are definitely going to read this. Talk to them, find out what they want to know, what they're getting out of the documentation. My go-to example for that is the Lassie project. It's the giant 70-page software documentation project, or software architecture diagram. Yeah, software architecture document. I'll get it out here in a second. And I knew who was going to read that, and went back and forth and discussed with them, hey, what do you need out of this document? What do you need to know so that you can write the software, so that you can go and build the hardware that you need? What do you need to know to make sure that you can operate whatever it is? So if you can, talk to your audience directly, or a subset of them. If you can't, if that's not feasible, then you may have to make some assumptions and some best guesses and iterate, and try to get feedback. If you're publishing a paper, you get feedback from your journal reviewers. If it's a website or another document like that, try to have some method for people to give you feedback and ask questions, and then iterate based on that feedback. And again, just like anything else, documentation projects aren't static. They require this constant cycle of improving and changing as you get new information. So just be aware of that and be open to that change cycle. So, any other questions, snide remarks? Silence.
I guess I have one for you, Dane. I guess, do you have any recommendations for, keeping up with the documentation as you are working actively on a project? Like, are there any tips that you might have of types of notes to write down while you're, working on a project, so that when you get to the documentation part, that it's easier to write those? Do you have any, advice or recommendations for that?
Some general information, and that's going to depend a lot on the type of project you're involved with. If you have a template of any kind that you can use, if you're doing something similar to what's been done before, try to fill in that template as you go. For your example, as an astronomer, you kind of know, okay, eventually it's going to turn into a paper. They're going to want to know the following things. You can get into adding those as you go, or at least taking rough notes. Similarly with the software architecture documents we do, there's a standard template for that, and so I try to fill in as I'm going. A lot of them are labeled, in the first weeks or months, TBD, to be determined. That's okay. Put a placeholder there. Know that, okay, I need to make sure I come back to that at some point. Another thing that I do, and again, this is more specific to software, and may not be directly applicable to other fields, but grabbing code snippets and code samples. If you've sat around in your Python terminal and you're doing data reduction, or you're working on this issue, and you figure out a way to make it work, go grab that that history. Go grab those lines that you typed. Okay, these are the commands that I ran. This is the file that I used. Whatever that might be, grab that, because if you switch hats and now you're the reader, then you're going to want to know, you're going to want to read the overview, the 3 or 4 paragraphs, and then you're going to want to type some stuff in IPython to get a graph. And so if you can give that to your audience very quickly and say, okay, type these 4 lines, here's your plot, then that'll help you and that'll help them both. So that's kind of what springs to mind. But again, it can vary depending on who your audience is and what specific type of work you're doing.
So Dane, where do you think, this might be a difficult question to ask in general. I mean, I could ask specifically just about the Green Bank Observatory software group, but for the observatory in general, what's your feeling about where we lay on the documentation spectrum? I mean, clearly we have some documentation, but also clearly we don't have enough.
Right. That's a wide-ranging conversation, and something that's I've given a lot of low-level thought to. You were correct in that we do have a lot of documentation, both in the software group and in other places. If you want to learn everything there is to know about being an operator, Dave's got that giant wiki document that they've been curating for ages, an enormous amount of troubleshooting and problem solving that's gone in there for the operators. The observer's guide is a good document. We give that to everybody that comes in every semester. We give that to somebody. There's a lot of excellent information that exists. Other groups, I'm sure, have their work, whatever they need. The machine shop has all their jigs and then blueprints and stuff, filed away. They're managing that. Science group has similar things. That said, probably the biggest thing that worries me long term, and this ties into both documentation and to some of the work that Ryan was doing in past quarters with the leadership cohort, is the need for knowledge transfer. We're starting to lose a lot of really experienced senior level staffers. And if we don't grab their knowledge, we're going to lose that and set ourselves back in terms of time to recreate what they already know. And unfortunately, there's no easy way around that in terms of firming up our documentation in various groups and grabbing what they know, other than to make it a project, to say, okay, we're going to tackle our documentation debt the same way as we're going to tackle our software debt, or refine an instrument, and actually treat it as a higher level project. Unfortunately, the realities are that there are budgetary and time constraints, right? We've all got more work than we can do, and it's hard to justify, hey, let me spend 3 months doing nothing but writing when there's all this other stuff that I need to be able to move forward as well. So in general, I think the only real answer I have is that we ultimately have to treat it like a project and have to realize that it is a need going forward, that it will help. A little work now will help a lot of work later, and just go forward with that mindset. Ryan, did you want to add anything to that, or anybody else that might have been thinking about this? I know I'm not the only person that's been kind of thinking about it.
I think you captured that well.
Hey, Dane, there's something I'd like to say.
Absolutely.
With regard to Natalie's question, I thought it was interesting that the way it was phrased, is something that we're trying to change. Natalie, you said when you get to the documentation part, where I think the ethos we're trying to generate, or at least the docs is trying to generate, is that the documentation is a fully integrated part of the project from the beginning. There is no documentation part any more than there is, like when you start observing, you do a quick look at your data, which could theoretically be part of your analysis that ends up in the paper, right? But you should be thinking about the documentation all along, right? At least that's the way I've been trying to think about it.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Larry. Yeah, and another thing that I didn't touch on directly in the talk, but I probably should have in retrospect, is treating the documentation as code and actually having the documentation live with the code or with the project, so that it is all integrated. It's one thing. One other thing that I did find interesting at the conference, at whatever that means anymore, is that a lot of larger organizations had dedicated people where yeah, they may have been an engineer, they may have been a project manager, but their title, their job in whatever role they were currently in was technical writing. It was, okay, this person's job is to make sure the API is documented for all of our users, for all of our customers. This person's job is to make sure the documentation exists for this project, just the same way that we would have, technicians assigned to a project to, to build, to build electronic components, or, okay, this project requires a machinist to, to build this section of the instrument, or a scientist to, figure out, these calculations. A lot of their projects actually have a dedicated documentation person. And that's something that the software group has started doing a little bit, but again, it's a challenge. We're, ultimately we are a small organization. We don't ever have as many resources as we'd like, so it can be difficult to prioritize that. But to Larry's point, I think he's exactly right that treating it as part and parcel of the entire project, not something you kind of tack on at the end, is definitely the way to go.
Dane, I have a question if you have time. It sort of plays into that document as you go thing. So I'm not sure if they covered this in the conference or not, but how do you feel about what information should go in, at least in terms of programming, in inline comments versus header comments versus your document, if there should be some level of redundancy or if they should be strictly different information in each?
So there wasn't any talk that I saw about that directly. I would say, to the extent possible, reduce double maintenance. So definitely don't write anything twice. There are a lot of tools available. Doxygen, Python has tools to grab comments and automatically document your methods and your classes. So for stuff like that, for things where it's just like, okay, here's this method, it has 7 different parameters, each of which have 4 possibilities. What do those mean? That could definitely be in the source code, in the comments, and then automatically turned into a PDF or online documentation as needed. For broader overview, I don't expect the contents of the entire architecture to be in the source code. That may live in a different document, and something that you could either reference or cite in the source code. So you might, in your source code, say, give your one sentence of, hey, here's this class that scans that starts a reference scan for Lassie. For more information, see and then reference where that document might live permanently. So developers will argue and fight over how much documentation should be in the comments versus not. In general, I would say the higher level principle would be avoid double maintenance. Don't write things twice, because they'll inevitably get out of sync. And be free to point to other resources. Be free to point to external documents in your source code, and be free to have those external documents point to the source code or the automatically generated API as needed too. So that's work both ways.
All right, I think Laura has one last question in the comments for chat.
Agile practices emphasize working systems over comprehensive documentation, which doesn't mean don't do documentation, but advocates that it is appropriately balanced and adds value. Do you have thoughts about how to achieve an appropriate documentation usefulness ratio? Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I'm someone who likes to write. Ray will look at me bizarrely because I would rather do the documentation part than the hacking the code part. He thinks that is just insane. But yeah, you don't want to spend so much time that you're, here's this beautiful, 150-page document, that no one ever reads. You don't want to create shelfware for certain. So I think that ties back a little to what Natalie and Larry were discussing earlier. where it should be part of the process. Again, make your documentation useful, but don't sweat over every little detail. Don't think you have to have a complete document when you're still changing things, and you're still actively developing something or exploring a topic or a concept. It's totally okay to have, lots and lots of lines that say TBD, to go back and fill that in later. I think so. Really, ultimately, in terms of, final thoughts, make your documentation useful. And lastly, and again, is a good example of that. We started the software architecture documentation and had some information there that was immediately useful in terms of how the software was going to be built. So we wrote enough that we could use it as developers. And then we didn't worry about it. There are things right now that we could be writing on, but it's not directly relevant. So we're going to wait until we do more iterations and more testing, and we need to update our documents so it's, it becomes useful. So I guess to succinctly answer Laura's question, write your documentation as you're going, and stop when it's no longer adding value to you going forward to your next iteration of your project.
All right. Well, thanks, Dane, for giving an excellent talk today. And we will see you all next week, next Thursday at 12:15 for the next lunch talk. All right, thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.